Good day. I'm going to suggest that the last few days, particularly the last couple of hours, have witnessed a sea change in Western policy with respect to Ukraine, or perhaps more properly, further pointers that a major row is going on behind closed doors, specifically in Washington, and that there has been the first grudging acknowledgement that the West is losing in Ukraine. But before I do that, before I discuss the significance of what has happened over the last couple of hours, let me do what I traditionally do, which is return to the topic of what is going on Ukrainian battlefields. First of all, we've had some important news from the two major military areas of military conflict. One is Bakhmut, the area around Bakhmut. The other is the northern area of Kupiansk, Svatovo, Kremenaya, Liman, the northern front. There's less news from Vuhledar, except that the Daily Telegraph has been busy writing up stories about a successful HIMARS strike on a Russian HQ in the area. Probably true, probably inconsequential. I'm not going to waste time discussing that particular report, which, to be frank, looks to me to have more of what you might call an informational nature. Let's discuss what's going on in those two other major areas of conflict, Bakhmut and Svatovo Kremenaya. Let's start first of all with Bakhmut. Yesterday I discussed how the fall of Krasnaya Gora, which is on higher ground, this village to the north of Bakhmut, is now opening the way for a Russian attack on Paraskovievka, perhaps rather larger village, also in that general area, which is another linchpin in Ukrainian defences in and around Bakhmut. And in fact, there's now been a whole cluster of reports, including maps, which show Paraskovievka entirely surrounded. There's Paraskovievka in the center, and you see the maps seem to show Russian-controlled territory all around Paraskovievka from every side. Perhaps there are still exits. I'm not physically on the ground. Perhaps there are still means for the Ukrainian troops in Paraskovievka to withdraw from this particular village. But it does look as if the fighters, the soldiers who are still, Ukrainian soldiers who are still in this village, are now in an absolutely critical situation. It's going to be very difficult for them to hold out for very many more days. And Denis Pushilin, who is the acting head of the government of the Donetsk People's Republic, Russian appointed, of course, and on the Russian side of things. But anyway, he's now provided an interview to Russia's TV channel 1, in which he has explained, as he sees it, the significance of the latest fighting. He says that the seizure of Paraskovievka will help cut off the road to Chasov Yar, and fierce battles are now raging in Paraskovievka. And TASS tells us that at a meeting with journalists, bloggers and public figures, Pushilin said that the Donetsk People's Republic, as a part of Russia, Pushilin said that Chasov Yar Road remained the sole supply route left for the Ukrainian battle group in Bakhmut. And he seemed to imply that once Paraskovievka is captured, that will mean that there will be no more main roads, no more access along main roads to the Ukrainian grouping in Bakhmut. And another Russian official, and I stress these are always Russian officials, but we always get more information about what's going on the battlefronts from these Russian officials, and up to now, most of their reports, it seems to me, have been reliable. I'll come to what the Ukrainians are saying in a moment. But another Russian official has, Mr. Marochko, also seems to be saying that the situation around Bakhmut is becoming critical, and it looks as if the Ukrainians are very close now to being fully trapped inside Bakhmut. And we've had what could perhaps be some degree of corroboration of this from, of all places, the New York Times. The New York Times is saying that the information that Ukraine is restricting, is prohibiting journalists from visiting Bakhmut is a sign that Ukraine is probably now considering withdrawing from Bakhmut. And going back to Marochko, this is this Russian official, he goes on to say that in the vicinity of Artyomovsk, as I said, Bakhmut is what I refer to this town, what the Ukrainian authorities call it, in the vicinity of the Artyomovsk populated locality, Ukrainian servicemen were observed abandoning their positions at will as a result of successful advancing actions by our assault units. The flight of Ukrainian soldiers from the previously occupied positions was detected, and Marochko is then quoted as saying that Ukrainian withdrawal is of a chaotic nature with clear panic signs. Weapons and military equipment are being left at firing positions. Now, I presume Marochko is well informed. That does seem a rather dramatic claim. Perhaps he's wrong. Perhaps this is a Russian official spreading stories that there is panic and that the Ukrainians are being routed and are fleeing from the battlefronts, leaving their weapons behind, apparently fleeing without orders. Perhaps he's saying that in order to spread alarm and despondency amongst Ukrainian troops. I can't discount that. In fact, it's quite likely. But I would also say that what Marochko has been saying up to now about fighting in and around Bakhmut has turned out to be, in general, reasonably accurate. Perhaps this is also. Now, I said that I would say what the Ukrainians are saying. The Ukrainian authorities, just as they did with Soledar, are denying that Krasnaya Gora, this village to the north of Bakhmut, the one that has opened the way for the capture of Paraskovievka, they are denying that Krasnaya Gora has fallen under Russian control. And I have to say, I find this astonishing, given that, as I pointed out in one of my more recent videos, actually Ukrainian maps that showed Krasnaya Gora under Russian control before the Russians themselves actually said that it was. So, you know, some Ukrainians are saying one thing, other Ukrainians are saying something else. Officially, Ukraine continues to insist it controls Krasnaya Gora. Having said that, what the Ukrainians say and what they really think and what they're actually going to do may not be necessarily the same thing. There's been also further reports that the Ukrainians have blown up a bridge located somewhere close to Bakhmut. I'm not exactly sure where. And there have been reports in both the Russian media and, interestingly, the Western media as well. I saw an article to this effect in The Guardian that the blowing up of this bridge by the Ukrainians may be a sign that they're intending to evacuate Bakhmut, and that presumably this bridge is being blown up in order to slow the Russian advance in this area and to give Ukrainian forces time to pull out. And of course we saw that the New York Times also appears to think that the fact that the Ukrainians are forbidding Western journalists, or journalists of any kind, from visiting Bakhmut might also be a sign that they're about to pull out from Bakhmut. And last but not least, on the subject of Bakhmut, there's been an article in the Wall Street Journal which says that if Bakhmut were to fall with large numbers of Ukrainian troops encircled, in other words, if there were to be another visible debacle comparable to the one in Mariupol, that might create disaffection and criticism of Zelensky, both in the West and in Ukraine itself. And this, of course, comes after a flurry of reports, which I've discussed in previous programs, that Western advisors, the Pentagon, has been telling Ukraine to pull its troops out of Bakhmut, though that's not something that the Ukrainians have done up to this point. Anyway, that's the nature of the fighting in Bakhmut. Some suggestions that the Ukrainians may be pulling out, unquestionably clear evidence that the Russians are closing in. Now, just to finish this discussion on Bakhmut, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, has said that he has seen absolutely no sign that the Ukrainians are pulling back from Bakhmut. He says that they're still fighting from every house in the town, that it's still going to take some time before this town is fully cleared and captured. And I understand that there's been other reports from other Russian officials which suggest that Ukraine is still trying to make a big fight of it in Bakhmut. So, contradictory discussions about what the Ukrainians might be intending to do. But again, the trend is completely clear. In Bakhmut, the situation for the Ukrainians continues to deteriorate. It is deteriorating fast. We had a whole sequence of events, starting with the fall of Bakhmutsky, this area to the west of Soledar, then Soledar itself, then other villages, Opitnoye, Kleshayevka, now Krasnaya Gora, other places to the north towards Seversk, fighting now in Paraskovyevka, clear evidence of fighting within Bakhmut itself. It's a progressive, incremental breakdown of Ukrainian resistance in Bakhmut. So that's one part of the battlefield. In some respects, what's going on in the northern battlefields around Kupiansk and Liman is perhaps even more dramatic, because there are now sketchy reports, but they look fairly reliable from Russian sources again, that the Russians have now basically reached the suburbs of Kupiansk, and that they're now edging very much closer to Liman. Both of these places, Kupiansk and Liman, were captured by the Russians earlier in the war. Ukraine then recaptured them over the course of the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and the capture of Liman especially enabled the Ukrainians to put increasing pressure on Svatovo and Kremenaya, and there was a lot of talk that if the Ukrainians captured those two towns, Svatovo and Kremenaya, they would be able to interfere with Russian logistics and communications to their forces further in Donbass. Well, the latest reports suggest that this Ukrainian advance is now definitely reversing, and that the Russian forces are coming very close to pushing the Ukrainians back across the Oskol River. Now, that this may be what is happening is also suggested by the latest briefing from the British Ministry of Defence. These intelligence briefings from the British Ministry of Defence, as I've said before, they're not really reports on what's going on the battlefields exactly. They are, more properly speaking, steers to the media about how to report, the British media, about how to report the war. But the basic story that the British Ministry of Defence is giving is that the Russians are making incremental small advances around Bakhmut and also across the entire front line. But they're also making these small advances along the northern front towards the Oskol River, even though the British Ministry of Defence hastens to reassure us that Russian forces aren't strong enough to achieve a breakthrough. That may be true, that may not be true, who knows? But it does suggest, and presumably the British do have some information, that the Russians are nonetheless quietly, gradually, incrementally pushing forward in the northern front, in this northern area. And of course, if they do come to the point where they've actually reached Liman, if they actually capture Liman, if they push Ukrainian forces back across the Oskol River and capture Kupiansk, recapture Kupiansk, if they are also able to capture Seversk, which is the northern town at the northern end of the Zelensky line leading south from Bakhmut north towards Seversk, if they capture Seversk, then I have to say that the entire Ukrainian position in north-central Donbass, in north-central Donetsk region, around Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, looks extremely precarious. And to be frank, without being a military expert, I would have thought that it was essentially undefendable. Now, to reiterate again, if Slavyansk, Kramatorsk fall, that will be the end of the main battle in Donbass. There would still be unresolved issues in the south of Donetsk region. Those will depend, I think, on what happens in Vuhledar. I've discussed all that in much detail in my previous program. But if Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are first invested, surrounded, and then captured, then I think we can start to say that the Battle of Donbass, the great battle that has been raging since April, and the main battle by far of this war, is coming to an end, and Russia will have won it, and Ukraine will have lost it. And given how important this battle is, how large the forces that Ukraine has committed to trying to hold on to Donbass have been, given also how difficult Donbass has been to capture because of the dense urban landscape there, the strong communications and defense lines, the fact that the fall of Donbass would open the way for a Russian advance right up to the Dnieper River in central Ukraine. Well, I think we would at that point say that the Russians, having captured Donbass, were in a position of overwhelming advantage, and though it might be too early to say that the war itself was drawing to an end, it would nonetheless be the case that Ukraine would be in critical difficulty. And that now brings me to what has been going on in NATO, within NATO. There's been a major NATO meeting, another one of these regular NATO meetings, and on the eve of it, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, an extreme, I would say, fanatical hardliner, gave a speech, and it was a very interesting speech. It went touched on all kinds of issues. Much of what he said was just confusing and all over the place. He talked, for example, this is directly after Seymour Hersh's report about the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines by the United States. Anyway, Stoltenberg talked about NATO ensuring protection for other pipelines and cable lines and all of those things. I have to say, I found that all very bizarre, given that he did not address the allegations about the attack on Nord Stream at all. But anyway, put that aside. The main thing that came across to me was that Stoltenberg was essentially talking about the fact that the NATO powers are unable to maintain supplies of artillery shells to Ukraine, that they're running out of the ability to do so. NATO stockpiles are becoming depleted, and Ukraine is using on a daily basis more shells, more 155 millimeter shells than NATO is able to produce. In fact, Stoltenberg actually admitted that the timeline for deliveries of shells is actually growing, that the pressure is now so intense that it's becoming more difficult rather than less to keep supplying Ukraine with shells. Now, of course, he did come up with all sorts of claims. He said that NATO will work to address this issue. But then, of course, he came up with some really very bizarre comments. He said, well, you know, we'll work an extra shift. That's going to presumably solve the problem. Or we'll put some of our factories on a 24-hour basis. There's also been some suggestions that the EU could come up with financing through reviving the devices used for the pandemic response a few years ago. Well, that will provide extra funding, but will it provide more shells? Money is all very good, but you need factories, you need workers, you need machine tools to produce these shells. It's not easy to just supply the money and to think that that's going to be enough to do that. And if we're talking about comparisons, well, the funding that the EU came up with for producing, well, I will call them medications. I'm still very careful, by the way, about the language I'm going to use on that topic, but I think we all know what I'm talking about. Anyway, the funding was all very well in that case, but it's important to remember that these medications are not actually principally produced on EU territory. Some of them are. They're produced in India, where the production facilities are on an enormous scale. There is no substitute for that. There's no analogy for that in terms of what the West can do with artillery shells. They can't come up with vast sums of money and then send them off to India and say, well, can you produce for me 155 millimeter artillery shells in the same way that you did all those substances that were used during the pandemic? It's not the same, because India would probably refuse. So you have to build up that production in the NATO states themselves. And Stoltenberg admitted that that was the case. But he didn't seem to understand what a complex operation that is. So he talked about, yes, you know, we have to increase the size of the factories and expand factory space and do those sort of things. That's all very well. Yes, you do, but you need more engineers, you need more technicians, you need more mechanics, you need trained people who can make these things. You need the machine tools to do it. You need all of those things. All of that takes time. Now, of course, if, as some brave people are suggesting, you convert the entire Western economies onto a war footing, you could probably do it within a couple of months. But realistically, are we going to put the whole Western economy on a war footing to keep Ukraine supplied with shells? The short answer is no, we are not. Western publics would not agree. Western business people would not agree. Trying to do something like that at a time of economic scarcities and economic pressures and economic difficulties is only going to further inflame and radicalize Western populations, which are becoming weary of this war. So, realistically, even if the money is there, which it probably will be, even if the money is there, it is going to take more than months, a year at least, more probably 5, perhaps 10, before the shells are produced on anything like the scale that would be needed, both to supply Ukraine with what it needs, and to preserve and in fact increase already severely depleted Western ammunition stocks. Now, a couple of weeks ago, I passed on a report from Reuters which said that the Pentagon is now advising Ukraine not to launch any offensives at the present time, not to try to engage the Russians in one-for-one artillery battles, to try to move over to a mobile defense. And I pointed out that this was essentially an admission that the West has lost the ammunitions war with the Russians. And Stoltenberg appears to know this, but of course, unsurprisingly, given the extreme position that he's taken, he can't bring himself to acknowledge or admit that. Instead, as I said, he comes up with comments like, well, we'll work another shift. we'll sort out this problem in some way. He doesn't really say how. And we've had another report of the same kind, this time from Politico. Now, this report is very interesting because it's about the ATACMS missiles. Now, there's been endless reports about how the United States is refusing to supply ATACMS missiles to Ukraine. Supposedly, it is because doing so would cross Russian red lines. The United States is not willing to do that because that would escalate the war in the way that the United States does not want. Now, over my most recent programs, as it's become increasingly clear to me that there are these production issues in the West and that Western supplies, arms supplies are becoming depleted, arsenals are becoming depleted, I've suggested that in fact the real reason why the United States is reluctant to supply ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, just like the real reason why it was previously unwilling to supply Patriot missiles to Ukraine, is because it doesn't have many of them. And that if it did supply ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, given the rate at which Ukraine launches missiles, it would deplete the available stock and the United States itself would be left short. And that is exactly what Politico is saying. The United States is now telling Ukraine. They cannot supply ATACMS missiles to Ukraine because the United States itself is short of ATACMS missiles. I think this is not something that the United States has wanted to admit to, because doing so would obviously make the United States look less militarily powerful than it wants to appear. And perhaps it's not the Ukrainians it wants to persuade that it is persuade about this. It's not to the Ukrainians that the United States is anxious to make it seem that it's more powerful militarily than it is. It is its other bigger superpower rivals, Russia and above all China. So the United States has not wanted to acknowledge the relatively small size of its ATACMS arsenal or the fast rate of depletion it would suffer if all of these missiles were shipped off to Ukraine. But now it's found itself in a position when it has to do so. And it's been absolutely fascinating to see the dismay that this is all starting to have, not just amongst NATO officials, but amongst parts of the Western media, as the extent to which the cupboard is empty is starting to sink in. I suspect that the political class in Washington, and I suspect in London eventually also, and probably the bureaucracies in Brussels, are going to come under a kind of slow motion shock when it begins to dawn upon them that far from having the biggest, most powerful armed forces on the planet, they are being outproduced by the Russians in ammunition, in missiles, in tanks, in all sorts of things. Stoltenberg again rather desperately said, that it's a question of quantity versus quality. We have the quality, the Russians have the quantity. They can outproduce us in shells and missiles and tanks, but our weapons are better than their weapons. And one of our tanks is worth 3, 5, 10, whatever it is, of theirs. I don't know whether Stoltenberg actually believes that. Perhaps he does. I know many people in the West do. But all I would say about this is that historical precedent, the precedent of recent wars, not just recent wars, but wars extending all the way back to the Korean War, actually tell a different story. The Russians, and before them the Soviets, are perfectly capable of producing advanced weapons. They produce weapons in enormous quantities, greater quantities than we are able to do in the West at the present time. And some of those weapons that they produce are at least as good as ours. So anyway, that's what people are hiding behind now. But one way or the other, as I said, it's now gradually coming home that tanks aren't going to make a difference. Western tanks aren't going to make a difference on the battlefields. Long-range missiles aren't going to make a difference on the battlefields. Ammunition can't be produced in the numbers needed to make a difference on the battlefields. It's the Russians who have the preponderance in all of these things, and that preponderance could easily grow. And there was an extraordinarily interesting article in the Financial Times, again, which said that all this talk about ammunition shortages, about the fact that Ukraine is short of ammunition, has concentrated minds within NATO. People are no longer talking about fighters, because fighter jets, well, they're complicated, expensive things, difficult to maintain, difficult to train to use. It would take months, perhaps years, before Ukraine had these in the necessary numbers to make a difference. And, well, what Ukraine needs is now, and that's ammunition. And that's why we must concentrate on ammunition. So one would almost get the impression that, this is suddenly people realizing that there are problems with ammunition, and that this means that we're no longer thinking about fighters to the same extent. Well, that, it seems to me, must be wrong, because these ammunition problems, people have known about them for a while, even though perhaps they've not impacted with Western policymakers as decisively as they are now doing. But perhaps there is a sense also that some people in the West are actually, at some level, relieved about the fact that they can talk about ammunition, because they know that their fighters are also in short supply, and that besides, if they did supply these fighter jets to Ukraine, well, for all the various reasons that I've discussed in previous programs, and which others like Brian Berletic have discussed, we would be looking at a potential debacle when the Russians eventually shot all these fighter jets down. By the way, a Russian official today has said that if the West did supply fighter jets to Ukraine, it would take, depending on the number supplied, between 2 and 3 months for the Russian Air Force and the Russian air defences to shoot all of them down. Now, that would be a very difficult thing for the West. So, no fighter jets, and of course, all those problems about supplying fighter jets that might take months, well, years to achieve. Realistically, it's going to take years to achieve in terms of sending artillery as well, or producing artillery shells in the necessary numbers to make a difference on Ukrainian battlefields. Bear in mind that if we don't have the factory space, the Russians do, and if we don't have the machine tools and the trained manpower, the Russians do. So let us say that we did what the United States says it's planning to do, increase artillery shell production 5-fold within 2 years. It's highly likely, in fact, I would say it is certain, that the Russians will increase their artillery shell production by multiples as well, thereby retaining the overwhelming advantage that they clearly have in artillery and in shells. So there we go. But of course, even as all of these problems are now coming to be realized in the West, we see the pushback as well. I've talked about how Stoltenberg isn't prepared to acknowledge the realities, the political realities that the logisticians are now pointing out to him, that the United States, NATO, can't supply Ukraine with the shells it needs. It can't supply Ukraine with the tanks it needs. It can't supply Ukraine with the fighter jets it needs. That Russia has all of these things and more, and that the advantage to the Russians is growing. Stoltenberg is being told all of this, but he comes up with things like, working extra shifts, and doesn't seem to face up to the consequences of all of this. But to get a further example of how divided things are, we now have another report in the Washington Post. And the interesting thing about this report in the Washington Post is that it contradicts an earlier report in Reuters. If you recall, about 2 weeks ago, there was that report from Reuters, which I discussed extensively at the time, which said that US officials, Pentagon officials, were briefing Reuters and other parts of the media that the US military is advising Ukraine not to engage in any counteroffensives, at least for the time being. Also telling Ukraine that capturing Crimea is beyond Ukraine's strength. And in fact, the Pentagon, some people from the Pentagon actually came and said exactly that to the House Armed Services Committee, and that these same people were telling Ukraine, these same Pentagon officials were telling Ukraine, husband your strength, learn to use these infantry fighting vehicles, these Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and Marder fighting vehicles and Leopard 2 and Leopard 1 tanks that you're being supplied. Don't engage the Russians in one-to-one artillery duels. Try to move to some kind of mobile defense. Husband your strength and only launch your offensives when you've properly learned how to use these things. Well, that was about 10 days ago in Reuters. But today in the Washington Post, I'm reading something completely different. Apparently now, the message that's coming, presumably from a different group of people in the Pentagon, is that Ukraine must be more active on the battlefields. It must do more decisive things. Presumably, it must engage in counterattacks, because it's highly likely that beyond July, funding from the United States will start to dry up. The Pentagon cannot guarantee that Congress will continue to provide funding to Ukraine. The Republicans in the House of Representatives are becoming increasingly unhappy. Representative Gantz has put forward a Ukraine fatigue bill, and this is starting to gain traction. So what Ukraine needs to do is to actually take the initiative. It's got to launch attacks. It's got to be more active in the war. In other words, one group of Pentagon officials, I suspect these are the uniformed military, are telling Ukraine, don't rush into attacks. You can't take Crimea now. Learn how to use these machines. Husband your strength. Another set of officials, I'm guessing these are the civilians, are coming along to Ukraine, telling the Ukrainians, well, you must launch your attacks now. If you don't, by July or August at the latest, funding from the United States must dry up, may dry up. You might find yourselves in an extremely difficult situation at that point. So the time to do it, the time to take the offensive is now. Now, I wonder what the Ukrainians are making all of this, because it's quite clear to me that there are two completely different factions in the Pentagon saying diametrically opposite things. We saw that with the fighter debate. So we saw with some people in the Pentagon very skeptical about supplying Ukraine with fighter jets. And then we read, again in the Washington Post, by the way, that there was a group of people in the Pentagon who are actually lobbying hard for Ukraine to be supplied with fighter jets. And as I said, I'm guessing, but I think this is a reasonable guess, that the more cautious, the more realistic, the more hard-headed group are the uniformed military, the people around the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the people who presumably commissioned that Rand Corporation report saying that the United States doesn't stand to benefit from a prolonged war, that the United States cannot establish a clear course for Ukraine to win in this war, that the United States needs to find some way to extricate itself from this situation. I'm guessing that's the uniformed bit military, and I'm guessing that it's they who are telling Ukraine, slow down, stop offensives, give up offensives for the time being, try and establish some kind of defensive, don't fight for every millimetre of territory, don't throw away the lives of your men doing that. And I'm guessing that it's the civilian appointments coming from within the administration, people who follow the Nuland, Blinken, Sullivan line, who are coming along to Ukraine and telling them, on the contrary, don't pay any attention to what our uniformed friends are saying. We must instead find some way. You must instead find some way to go on the attack. Now, none of this makes any kind of sense. I'm afraid, given the balance of political forces in Ukraine itself, it's much more likely, however, that Ukraine will listen to the bad counsel of, I'm guessing, the civilians who are telling it to go on the attack, than to the much wiser, or at least more rational counsel of the uniformed military who are telling it to slow down, try to husband and conserve forces and avoid going onto the attack and losing more men and machines before you're really ready. But the point is this: there's now clearly an argument going on. I don't think there's any doubt about this. The fact that we're seeing an article in the Washington Post which has the Pentagon advising Ukraine to do one thing, take a more active stance in the conflict, contradicting what an article a short time ago in Reuters was saying, which is hold back, conserve your forces, retreat from Bakhmut. Well, that clearly now shows that there is an internal battle. And you can see that in Stoltenberg's speeches. Your speech, the one I discussed yesterday, where he admits that there's ammunition shortages, but he won't accept the logic of that. He's still coming up with all sorts of fantasies about, cranking up artillery production rapidly to the point of overtaking Russia's or whatever it is he thinks that NATO can do. So you could see that there are increasing disagreements, and you can also start to see that within this very, very limited window of debate that's allowed in the media in the West, there are now different parts of the media, or at least different journalists, who are siding with different factions. So I was reading, for example, today in the Financial Times, an article by Gideon Rachman, which said that it is absurd to blame the West for the Ukraine war. Now, if you'd been reading the Financial Times over the last year, you probably wouldn't be aware of the fact that anybody is blaming the West for the Ukraine war. So this is an acknowledgement that a blame game of some kind is actually taking place. The article, by the way, by Gideon Rachman is a long riposte to the criticisms of Western policy that have been made by Professor Mearsheimer, the acknowledged foreign policy expert and chief realist in the United States, who's been saying that Ukraine was led up the garden path with promises of NATO membership, which the United States, which the West was never in a position to fulfill. And this has been Professor Mearsheimer has been making these points now for not just months, but years. But here we have, finally, an opinion piece in the Financial Times which takes issue with him. Now, again, as I said, this is a reflection, surely, of a debate that is finally taking place. And, one sees this in other places as well. There was a letter in the Daily Telegraph today. Well, letters to the editor come from all sorts of people, but this one was given unusual prominence. It said again that, NATO, meaning the United States, but also people like Stoltenberg and the British government, have never given a clear explanation of how they expect Ukraine to win its victory. And this article went on to say that there was no this letter rather, went on to say that there was no real way in which Ukraine could win a victory. So you could see that there is toing and froing. You see that people like Gideon Rachman are trying to defend the Western position, that this war is entirely the fault of Russia, which is, of course, the official Western position. The very fact that they're having to defend it is indicative that, as I said, there's a blame game going on. You see others increasingly asking the question, originally also asked in that Rand Corporation study, well, what is victory in Ukraine? What is the end point that the West is looking for in Ukraine? How do you achieve that end point? And besides, we're running out of weapons, we're running out of machines to send, we can't train enough Ukrainian soldiers to replace those who've already lost their lives or been wounded or incapacitated in some way that they cannot continue the war. Now, for the moment, it's clear to me that the hardliners still are very much in the ascendant. As I said, Stoltenberg may acknowledge the problems, but he's neither offering solutions to these problems, but nor is he accepting the logic that the problems, the lack of weapon systems, the lack of factory space and all that are imposing upon him. And the fact that there are people telling the Ukrainians from within the Pentagon that, you must move to a more active conduct of operations than the one that you have been showing up to now, despite the fact, we had lots of reports about how exhausted the Ukrainian army has become, how it's running out of machines, how it's running out of men, how it's suffered enormous losses, how it's outnumbered by the Russians. The Russians have more guns, more artillery, more shells, more tanks, more planes, more missiles. When he's hearing less about Russia running out of missiles. Well, we see that this debate continues to be underway, but as I said, the hardliners remain in the ascendant. Now, I wonder for how much longer, and I'm going to say this, the realists, the people I would call the realists, they need, if they are going to stop this runaway train, to start being a little bit more courageous than they have been up to now. They need to start briefing on the record. They need to start coming out and saying openly and straightforwardly what they know, which is that Ukraine is losing the war, that there's no realistic way that this can be turned round, and that the only way to avoid a total debacle is to start negotiations with the Russians. And that might realistically, given the situation in Kiev, be direct negotiations between Russia and the United States, despite all the difficulties that involves. After all, the United States has done the same thing in the past. In the 1960s and early 1970s, the United States negotiated directly with North Vietnam in Paris. The lead negotiators towards the end of those negotiations, as I very well remember, were Henry Kissinger for the United States and Le Duc for North Vietnam. South Vietnam was excluded from the negotiations. The United States negotiated directly with the Taliban in Doha. It cut out the Afghan government, which it was previously supporting. In both cases, South Vietnam and Afghanistan were very unhappy, but the United States had to acknowledge the reality and engage in negotiations in that sort of way. And the United States, which has been waging a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, but is now finding that its Ukrainian proxy is losing that war, needs perhaps to be more realistic, and it needs to start those negotiations. But given how entrenched this group is in Washington, this neocon group, the people who made the decision to launch that attack on the Nord Stream pipelines, given how entrenched that group is, it's not enough for people to brief in the way that they've been doing, for one faction in the Pentagon to be telling Reuters one thing, and then for the opposing faction to tell the Washington Post the diametric opposite. It's not good enough for people to say off the record, well, you know, we're out of ammunition, we're out of supplies, we can't supply ATACMS missiles to Ukrainians because we don't have enough of them, but to do so privately, and then let someone like Stoltenberg come along and give a whole press conference in which he implies that there are solutions to these problems, when in fact, in any realistic time horizon, there are none. They've got to come out openly and be prepared to take these people directly on. Now, that might put some of these people in a difficult position. They might face the usual personal criticisms that one gets if one starts saying unpopular things. The neocons have shown a consistent willingness to say incredibly rude things about their opponents, their critics. But they have, the realists, if I'm going to call them that, have to think, or so it seems to me, about the overriding responsibility they have to their own countries, first and foremost the United States, Britain, the other NATO states, and they need to act on that responsibility and face whatever pressure, whatever abuse comes their way. They might have some difficult sessions in Congress, they might face some difficult criticisms in the media, but I have absolutely no doubt at all that if they come out and speak frankly and straightforwardly, they will find that public opinion is behind them. Certainly in the United States, certainly in Germany, before long, elsewhere as well. The quicker they do that, and the quicker they start making it clear also that this little small group of extreme hardliners that have concentrated themselves in the White House are leading this train, this runaway train, driving this train towards the abyss, then the better it will be. And far better to have it done that way than to have a situation when the debacle finally happens and everybody is blamed for it, than to have it perhaps avoided, even if there is criticism along the way. Anyway, that is what I think. To summarize, I think that over the last few weeks, over the last couple of days, maybe even over the last few hours, the recognition of that logistical barrier, that supply barrier, what's been talked about by people like Alex Vashinin, Brian Beletic, Scott Ritter, to some extent, yours truly, I think that's finally dawned. It might be a shattering thing to acknowledge fully and in public that the Russians can outproduce us, and never mind the Chinese who can do it much more, but that the Russians, just the Russians, can outproduce us in certain critical areas of weapons manufacturing. But the sooner this fact is acknowledged, the better it will be. Anyway, that's where I end today's program. More from me soon. Lots of developments, I suspect, over the next few days. More reports, by the way, coming from Bakhmut, even as I've been making this program. I haven't been able to follow them, but no doubt much more coming, which will be discussed in my program tomorrow. And just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You should also check out our shop. Buy yourself the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those things. And last but not least, please remember to tick the like button and check your subscription to this channel if you've liked this video. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.